we already tested it. So the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Enrica. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I think this is the third time I've presented in this course at different points in time, and it's always fun to come back and share where I am in my own journey as a researcher. And just before I get into the actual presentation, the presentation I'm going to give today is a little bit of a hybrid presentation. In the past, I've given what I consider typical research talks, ending with, given that I work in kind of an experimental quantitative paradigm with a lot of data and analysis. And I decided today instead, and do something people often don't do, is present research that's really much in progress right now. So as opposed to showing up with this beautiful golden egg that's all polished and makes me look like I really know what I'm doing all the time, I'm going to talk today about something that I'm working on and putting some of the challenges. And I think that's useful given a course like this, where if you're thinking about doing your thesis right now, things such as feasible work, what actually happens versus what we think is going to happen. And these are things, because as you'll see at the end, when I went to do the thank you, this project has involved over 30 researchers working on it. And so it's the biggest project I've ever done, perhaps the biggest project I will ever do. I don't know if I want, especially during a pandemic, this type of work, but anyway. So with that in mind, here's what I would like to share with you today. So the talk itself, as I said, the effects of cognitive individual differences. I'll talk about what individual differences are, and particularly looking at the learning of agreement. I'll talk what that is among learners of French here in Toronto. In particular, I'm going to be looking at people who have either Arabic or Mandarin as a first language. And I see by looking at the participant list that I imagine some of you share those first languages. This may be something you've actually been through on your own. So today's presentation, I have four main sections. I'm going to begin by starting something we don't do at a conference presentation, but I thought would be good for today, is talking about my positionality as a researcher, where I'm coming from, why I see the world as I do, and why I research as I do. And then we'll move on to the problem of, or the research problem, particularly what is a grammatical agreement, and what, when we look at second language learners, do we mean by interlearner variability, and how do we understand that? And then I'll finish the fourth section today will be the study itself, which is this large-scale study I've been running for the last couple of years. That will be concluding in May, at least the data collection. And as you'll see, there's relatively little results. Not to disappoint, but I'm going to focus more on the process today. I think that's more relevant to where you are right now in your own journey. Okay, so my positionality as a researcher, I normally didn't do this, but I thought, you know what, and I was looking at, for example, all the many interesting talks in the course this year, and I kind of felt a little bit marginal in the sense that the kind of work I'm doing is probably not as calm as what some of the other themes I saw in the types of research you'll be going over. So I wanted to give you a bit of background on who I am and why I do the things the way I do, so that when we get into the study itself, I think things will make more sense. And one of the things I often do with my own graduate students, I often talk about the sociology of research. I think this is very important to think about why we're doing it, including sometimes we do things because that's the village that raised us. And the village that raised me was one of linguists. I was particularly raised as a Chomskyan generativist. I don't do that anymore, but it shapes the way we see things such as language and acquisition. So something we want to keep in mind, because sometimes it's a limitation on what we're doing. So who am I? So I'm a native speaker of English, as you can probably guess. I'm a second language learner of French, near native, I would say, and I'm a low-level now German learner. My German has recessed since my time in Europe. I'm also a language teacher. So when I go at this work, I'm both ESL and FSL instructor, particularly with adults. And finally, what's maybe most relevant to what I'm going to talk about today is I'm an experimental linguist. So my research method is always experimentation, hypothesis, data collection, and then a quantitative analysis. That said, I have many applied interests, and the older I get, the more I want what I'm doing in the lab to actually have consequences for the classroom. So that's one of my current growing interests in evidence-based pronunciation instruction. For example, right now I'm working with a number of colleagues to propose a new textbook series for evidence-based instructional material. And we know, while we may talk about that, finding actual textbooks that are evidence-based, very, very hard to come by. So what about language? Something I wanted to mention as well. So what do I understand when we talk about language in second language acquisition? So as a cognitivist, that's how I identify. I really believe that language is a cognitive system. It's shaped by the way our brains work, for example, memory, attention, as well as our physiology. So I'm someone, interestingly today, I'm really kind of outside of my main zone of comfort, if you want, because my main area of research is pronunciation, second language phonetics. But so physiology is our auditory and our articulatory systems shape the way we use language, including when we're learning it. And of course, language is learned in a context. It's shaped by a user's linguistic and their social experience as well. So what are we learning? We're learning things that are both implicit and explicit. Today, the study looks at both. And that's both quantitative. So I'm kind of truly a mixed methods, or at least mixed knowledge type of researcher. So for example, qualitative knowledge, such as what does a word's form look like? Its written and spoken form and its meanings, as well as quantitative learning. One of the variables I'm going to look at today is statistical learning. And so one of my understandings of language is we're actually learning about probabilities of how languages work. So for example, if you're learning English or French, you know that if you start with a consonant P, it's more likely the next sound will be an L rather than a Y sound. So these are statistical things we learn about language. Now, second language acquisition, which is my main area of expertise, and you'll see once again, talking about positionality, I don't talk about SLA as we often do. Coming from linguistics, I talk about L2A. So these are things, we think about, how do we use these labels? How does it affect how we see the object of study? So for me, I work within the broader area of bilingualism, okay, including interactions between a learner's first and second language. That's one of the big themes of this project, and also in third language acquisition. I believe that second language acquisition, for me, first and foremost, looks at the acquisition of these types of area of linguistic competence, vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and sociopragmatics, that is, appropriate language use with others. And of course, it's shaped by many variables. That's kind of the big theme of today's talk, which variables do what. And these include input quality and quantity, as well as aptitude. And so some of the variables we'll be talking about today, for example, working memory, are components of language aptitude. Okay, so that's the introduction. Who am I? Kind of what's the general village I live in? And how does this orient me to studying a second language learning or second language acquisition? So the phenomenon I want to talk about today is one of grammatical agreement. And for me, this is interesting. This was actually the topic of my own master's thesis now, which is like 26 years ago. And it's funny how I moved away from it, and 26 years later, here I am again looking at the same topic. So I'm sure we all know in general what agreement, if we're a language teacher, we often say the verb has to agree with the subject, but agreement is even larger. And so let's talk about what it is, at least from a linguistic perspective. So agreement is simply a phenomenon that allows us to signal the links between elements in a phrase or a sentence. So here's an example. If someone says to you the following sentence, Pete wrote to your brother Adam and your sister Katie, but only she answered. Because of agreement, you know that Pete only heard back from Katie and not from Adam. And why is that? Because in English, pronouns agree in gender. So Katie and she can't agree with the brother Adam. So this is why this is important to study among learners. So along with word meaning and word order, agreement is one of these key things that allows us to communicate effectively. And when second language learners struggle with this, this leads to breakdowns at times in communication. So now agreement across languages, the study I'm going to present later focuses on 4 languages. It focuses on individuals who are native speakers of Arabic or Mandarin, who are highly competent users of L2 English, and who are at different stages of learning French. So we have 3 in each speaker of these learners interacting languages. So why is this relevant here? Well, first and foremost, languages vary a lot. And in terms of agreement, some things all languages use, others don't. And of course, we know that one of the predictors of a relative difficulty of learning is the similarity of a given structure or phenomenon between the L1 and the L2, or here the L3. So for example, things that are semantic, so these are basic inherent meanings, things such as number, singular versus plural. Things such as person, first, second, third. So first, the person speaking, second, the person being addressed, the interlocutor, third being someone who's outside of the actual communicative act, and then tense, basically the relationship between the moment of speaking and the moment of action. Something happened before, we call that past. If it's concurrent in time, we call that present. If the act follows the speaking event, we call that future. So most languages have those features. And in theory, we see that, or not just in theory, in practice, learners typically are fairly good at these fairly quickly. Now, what's challenging and what's the focus of the study I'm presenting today is rather grammatical features. So these are features that are not meaning-based in the same way, but they have a linguistic function. And today we'll be looking at gender. So in many languages, nouns are split into two. Sometimes it's a 3 classes. For example, in German, you also have a neuter class, but typically between masculine and feminine. This is also the case in Arabic, for example, one of the languages we'll be talking about today. So just to give an example, I'm going to skim over this. This is, if we looked at, for example, the verb to relax in the past tense. Now, what we'd see, once again, I'm going to do this quickly, I'm not getting the details. We would see that there are 2 types of languages here. We have languages like English and Mandarin, where the verb itself really doesn't change form. So I relaxed, you relaxed, she, he relaxed, we relaxed, you plural relaxed, they relaxed. The verb does not agree in any sense with the subject. It's marked for past tense. Mandarin, similarly, we change the pronoun, but we don't change the verbal form. Now, French and Arabic are quite different. They're what we call a rich agreeing language, or rich agreeing languages. And for example, if we just take the example here for French, I relaxed, we see it's a complex form. Je me suis reposé. So we have je, the I, and then we have a pronoun myself, me. We have an auxiliary verb, suis, am, first person singular. And then if the verb is conjugated for a female speaker, we add in writing an E at the end. So to correctly make this verb agree, there's 4 types of agreement, at least perhaps 5, that have to take place. So going from an English or Mandarin type system to a French system involves learning a lot of complex things about the language, including how agreement works. Now, we won't look at Arabic in detail, but you can see just by the size of the example, Arabic is very much like French. It has a very complex system that agrees with things such as person, number, and gender. It's even more complex than French. So here we have a case of 2 types of learning problems. One, perhaps more challenging problem going from a very simple English or Mandarin-like system towards French, or going from a highly complex system, perhaps even more complex system like Arabic to French. So how does that affect learning relative difficulty? Similarly, if we look at gender agreement, I don't know how many of you speak French. I'll pretend no one speaks French, and that way I don't make any kind of bêtises. So basically, how does it work? Well, in French and Arabic, nouns are masculine or feminine. This is not the same thing as biological sex. It is simply a factor. So you can have things such as a table is feminine, a book is masculine. Why? People often don't have any idea why, okay? Now, the important thing for us here today is that this grammatical gender has reflexes for modifying elements like articles and adjectives. So if you look at the 2 examples for French, you have un petit livre. Livre being masculine is preceded by a masculine singular, the, un, and a masculine singular, small, petit. In contrast, if you have feminine table, you say une petite table. Okay, une feminine singular, petite feminine singular, small. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a typo there. That should be feminine under small. So there's my own agreement error, but luckily it's not with the language, but with the translation. So we see that we have to make these units agree. And what's the function of this? Agreement simply shows that these words come together, and they come together into something we call a noun phrase. And agreement allows learners, our interlocutor rather, to parse these things. So when learners make these errors, they're very jarring for fluent speakers in comprehension. They understand correctly, but there's often they have to go back, reparse, and move on. So this is, along with intelligibility, this is a comprehensibility issue. So we should be interested in this as language teachers. Arabic similarly has a system here. The main difference between Arabic and French is an Arabic example. Here the adjective follows, otherwise similar agreement with gender. Okay, so languages are different, including in their verbal agreement and in their gender agreement. So how do learners do with this? Well, the answer is typically not so well, if we're honest about this, particularly into more advanced levels of proficiency. So we know that acquiring grammatical gender in a 2nd or 3rd language, I'll use 2nd, it's second or third, peu importe, doesn't matter. So this is a persistent problem, including for very, very fluent speakers like myself. This is one of those errors I still make sometimes, agreement, including in writing. And so we know that this happens particularly with complex tasks. So if you're doing something that's very demanding on your memory or very, very technical writing, as well as with fatigue. Of course, when fatigue enters, it has effects on working memory, on computation, on their ability to retrieve things from our memory. So this is a challenging, ongoing problem. Now, when the errors occur, what do learners typically do? So what type of errors might we expect in the data collected in this study? Well, there's two types of errors. There are errors of omission and there are errors of incorrect agreement. So typically less proficient learners will actually simply omit those morphemes, those prefixes, suffixes, or grammatical words that are necessary for agreement. So here's something when I was teaching ESL, sounds very typical to me. Oh, she says she coming, as opposed to she said, third person singular, she is auxiliary coming. So simply we drop the morpheme that realizes agreement, and particularly if we don't have those type of morphemes, those grammatical words in our first language. Now, as learners progress, or learners who have agreement, then they tend to make things agree, but not right. So for example, a typical error in French is overuse of the masculine, and that's a common error in many languages, because masculine is often seen as the unmarked, the more frequent, the simpler form. So you might get something like a large box, which should be une grande boîte. And so here, for example, they get the article right. They say une, but then grand is left in the masculine form. So une grande boîte, okay? Very strange, but for native speakers, but very common for learners of languages with agreement, okay? So why does this happen? So this study isn't seeking to say why. It's more of the how and who does better and who does less well. But people who have tried to explain why is agreement so challenging in second language, why is it persistent? Well, there's two main reasons. The first reason is that often this is due to first language influence. Okay, so for example, Hawkins and Francoschino, who are working within the Chomskyan paradigm, they say that if you don't have a feature like gender in your first language, you're born with the ability to learn it, but then you get rid of it. You simplify things you don't need. And unfortunately, you can't access those same features later on in life. So you're it's called an impairment hypothesis. Other people say, well, you might be able to understand agreement, but when you come to produce it, you don't have the pronunciation, the phonology to realize the third person S, for example. On the other side, another slightly different approach is related to parsing. So second language learners are not as efficient parsers as native speakers. That's a common, regardless whether it's word access. And so that people have proposed, for example, that learners know about agreement, but when they're in real-time speech production or writing, they can't access those third-person singular S, those past tense EDs in ways that allow for accurate agreement. Or Pieneman, in his model, the processability theory, argues that language learning, including first language learning, involves developing more complex agreement mechanisms. There we go. So for example, early on, we can make an agreement within the noun phrase. Then we can make an agreement between the noun, the subject, and the verb phrase, etc. Excuse me, and on this understanding in second language, basically we start back where kids start. So this is the idea. Second language learners go back to the basic. They can only make things agree, if anything, within the phrase, but they can't make the noun, the subject agree. And those processes have to emerge with time. Sometimes they never emerge. Okay, so that's the problem. So my interest here is about these agreement phenomena that are so important for comprehensibility, intelligibility, that tend to be so difficult even for advanced speakers. And now, how do we predict who may do better at what? And of course, there are pedagogical implications. I won't talk about those. We could talk about those in the question period, but before we can develop an evidence-based pedagogy, we have to know what the evidence is. So this is an evidence collecting study. Okay, but before we get to this study, the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of variability. So why might different learners be different than others? Important question in the classroom. We know our classrooms are not homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. Even if we're teaching a B1 level, whatever, we know that different learners will have different challenges. So this type of variability, well, first of all, some of this variability is just because second language users are speakers, and all speakers of all language language is variable. So for example, we know that the way we talk changes based on who we are and to whom we're speaking, to our interlocutor. So for example, different dialects will have variability. People of different age will vary in their speech, of different genders, of different socioeconomic status. We also know that what we're doing, how we're using language to understand or speak, the communicative task and the situation where we're communicating affect things. So formality, we don't talk the same way in formal versus informal speech. The type of speech act, we won't talk the same way to make a request as we will to give an order. And finally, something that's emerging is, this is probably the last 20 years, is bi and multilingualism affects the way we speak. So even when you're not speaking your second or non-dominant language, it has direct effects on your speech perception, your word use, your syntax, and it actually changes your grammar. This is very fascinating over time. So here's another source. So those are sources that are common to anyone using language, writing, speaking, listening, etc. What about L2 learners in particular? This is once again the focus of this study. Well, we know that L2 learners, they're even more variable than native speakers. Okay, and that's often said, one of the real characteristics of second language learning is the incredible variability, both between speakers, interlearner variability, and also with the same speaker, right? We've all seen that, the same sentence, the verb is inflected, it agrees in the subject, in the first part of the sentence, and the conjoined part of the sentence, all of a sudden the verb agreement's gone. Why? So this is one of the main goals, at least within the type of paradigm I work, along with first language influence, how development works, understanding why different learners do things differently, at least in some contexts. And in the shortest form, that is the object of study of what I'm presenting today. So why? So in the same way we can explain why L2 learners may have problems with agreement, we also can explain why they may be variable in their language learning, their language comprehension and production. And of course, some of the same factors come again. Well, cross-linguistic influence, these are bilinguals or multilinguals. Their languages are always activated at certain levels and will influence their language use. Also, as learners, well, they have different language experiences. So first language learning children have more typical learning experiences across learners of a first language, but we know very well, if you survey your students in a class, they have had many different experiences, the number of years they've been learning, how, the type of communicative tasks they've been able to practice, as well as proficiency, of course. Finally, the third source, and once again, this is today's focus, is individual differences. I'll turn to that right now. And obviously, if you've done the reading, you know what we're going to talk about it, but here we go. Okay, so what are individual differences? So in brief, these are characteristics of human beings. And I'm going to talk about differences that are relevant to language use and learning, but you can talk about individual differences, even how people purchase a car, what team they would bet on for the FIFA finals. There's always individual differences in everything we do. So these are dimensions of enduring personal characteristics. You may have heard of things such as personality traits, things that we our entire life share. And these are assumed to apply to everyone. So all learners could potentially be affected by this, and which they differ by degree. So in the terms of quantitative research, these are typically continuous variables. And in the case of second language learning, we're going to talk about now, well, what are the relevant ones for learning? You may have seen these in other classes. Well, we typically have two families. We have cognitive variables, the focus of today's project, but we also have affective variables, which I won't be talking beyond one slide here. So cognitive individual differences. Cognitive, we know that's about thinking, about the brain. So four that I'm going to talk about today, and once again, because my focus is more on methodology, I won't go into great depth of any of these, but I will highlight why they're important for language learning, particularly of grammar. So of course, memory, and we know that memory is one of the biggest predictor of whatever we're doing of our final outcomes, our use, okay? Executive function, so I'll talk about this in a second with a model of memory. Executive function is basically the boss of the memory system who allows us to direct attention and to use resources efficiently. And it's another predictor. Next, metalinguistic awareness or metalinguistic ability, slightly different. So this is once again the ability to use, to be aware of language structure and to be able to manipulate it. And finally, on a very cognitive approach, as I've already mentioned, there's statistical learning, our ability to recognize patterns and to, over a large set of examples, like imagine you hear 1,000 sentences in the target language in a month, being able to extract the common patterns in the language. Okay. Now, affective individual differences, which might interest you more, I don't know, but they're not my area, I'm a cognitivist, are things such as motivation. Clearly, motivation is one of the big predictors of outcomes. And then two that you may be less familiar with, but as classroom teachers, I think they're equally important. Foreign language anxiety, for one. Foreign language anxiety is something called a state anxiety. That means people are not necessarily anxious in general, but when it comes to using, particularly to producing orally, that's the worst thing to do. So luckily I'm in my L1 today. If I had to do this in French, I'd be a little bit more anxious. So this, obviously, there's a negative correlation between L2 anxiety and language use. And a variable that's becoming more and more interesting, I think particularly interesting for classroom, is something called foreign language enjoyment. And Dewaele, Jean-Marc, he's one of the big people in this idea that having pleasure in language learning does correlate with outcomes. So that's something obviously we can, along with motivation and anxiety, motivate. In that sense, in some ways, you could say that the affective variables are more interesting to classroom teachers because we have more of an effect on them than the cognitive variables, which often we cannot manipulate. And I use manipulate in the scientific way, not in some type of Machiavellian. I'm not a language teacher who tries to make my learners do things that they shouldn't be doing. Okay, so let's talk about two of these cognitive variables. The first one is working memory. So once again, working memory is one of those huge predictors. In the same way, when you look at children learning so many things, socioeconomic status, we know, is a huge predictor of outcomes, including the number of books, for example, in a child's home. Well, in learning in general, working memory is one of those huge predictor variables. So what is working memory? You may have heard of short-term memory, long-term memory, working memory. I'll talk about working memory. So working memory has two components. It is a memory system that is both storage in one side, and the other portion of it is manipulation and processing. So you can imagine why this is so important. Let's take, for example, grammatical gender agreement. What is actually involved in learning the difference between un petit livre et une petite table? Well, one of the things you have to do is you have to be able to store in your short-term memory those two forms to compare them. In the written form, for example, the presence versus absence of an orthographic E, and the fact that that's feminine versus his absence being masculine. So in order to extract patterns, you have to be able to hold them and process them in real time. So individuals who have better working memory are better at doing that. So working memory in particular has been shown to be very important for grammar learning. So what are the models of working memory? Well, if you work on memory, and this is, I've had students who worked on this, and that's one of the things I love about being a thesis supervisor. You learn about things you knew very little or nothing about. You might not admit that originally from your students. And so I recently had one of my PhD students who finished last year looking at the role of working memory and L2 anxiety on acquiring L2 French grammar. And so getting back to the model, so Baddeley is the model that's most cited here. And there's this idea that memory, working memory, once again, has these four main components. So the central executive is like the boss. She or he or they are the director of this system. And not only do they, for example, manipulate attention between the auditory or the visual domain, it also interacts with long-term memory, which is where we really know things. It allows us to put things together into larger components if we want. So the three subsystems, first is the visual spatial sketchpad. So as its name, in part visual input, allows us to store and process that. The episodic buffer is another system that brings things together. So in psychology, an episode is a moment of knowledge. So for example, right now, I'm talking to you, I'm in a space, I may have a parched voice, I may be stressed. That's an episode right now. And the episodic buffer allows us to work with those type of episodes. Finally, the phonological loop, once again, phonology sound. This is a portion of working memory that allows us to rehearse, to store, depends sometimes 2 to 5 seconds sounds, okay? And this is necessary, for example, not only for learning, but also for speaking. So as I'm speaking right now, my auditory system is checking that what I'm saying makes sense. What I think makes sense does make sense. And this is in part calling on the phonological loop. For memorization, for example, vocabulary, this is the part of memory that allows us to repeat. And repetition is necessary to transfer from short to mid or long-term memory. So another very important component. Okay. The other thing I want to go a little bit more in detail is metalinguistic awareness, because this is something we can work on. This is a cognitive variable that we can work on as language teachers. So this is simply the ability to be aware of language structure and to be able to manipulate it. Moreover, if we talk about metalinguistic, not just awareness, but ability, it's also the ability to verbalize it. So for example, in a classroom, to do a talk aloud protocol. And we know that metalinguistic awareness is incredibly important. So for example, for child reading, along with SES, socioeconomic status, one of the best predictors is phonological awareness, children's ability to know that words have an onset concept, coda concept, they have a rhyme. This is very, very important. Okay, so there we are. So far, things about variability, things about agreement. So that's the variability is the learning phenomenon we're going to talk about now. The agreement is the language phenomena that's going to be studied. So how do we go about that? So this study right now, language experience and linguistic skills among multilingual learners in higher education, is a two-part study, and I'm responsible for part 2. Part 1 is focusing on Spanish at the University of Waterloo and the University of California, Santa Barbara, and they're looking more at the advantage that third language learners may have over second language learners. So for example, if you're an English learner directly of Spanish, are you less able than someone who did English, French, Spanish, because French and Spanish have shared lexicons, vocabularies, grammar. So that's the other part of the study. In this part of the study, we're looking at two main factors. The first language, comparing Arabic and Mandarin speaking learners, so inter-language variability, and then within a group of learners, so for all the Mandarin speakers, for all the Arabic learners, why are they doing things differently, the intra-group variability. Okay, so there we go. So this study is looking at people who have Arabic or Mandarin as a native language. Some of these speakers, particularly in the Arabic group, could be heritage speakers, that is speakers who may have lesser literacy skills, and it's something we'll have to control for later. Luckily, the type of statistics we have nowadays allows us to use an individual as one of our variables, things we can't do with ANOVAs and the like, okay? And these are people who have learned English. They're all highly proficient English users, so we'll be looking at the contribution of their L1, their L2 English vocabulary and grammatical knowledge. And then finally, we'll be looking at these cognitive variables, 4 in particular. I won't be talking about them in great depth, other than maybe 2 to some extent. So their working memory, their executive function, their metasyntactic awareness, so particularly their awareness of syntactic grammar structure and statistical learning. And all of this, how does it affect those structures I talked about already, their ability to do gender agreement in French, and as well as verbal agreement in French as a third language. Okay, so as any study, we have a set of hypotheses. What are ours? So there's 2. The first one is the between language group, the Arabic versus Mandarin speakers. So this is the question, does it make a difference what your first language is? And we already had part of an answer to this, okay? So the general hypothesis is that the presence of a rich agreement system. So we saw that Arabic, like French, had this very rich system. English and Mandarin is not pejorative, it's just a linguistic term, have a weak system or impoverished. It's relatively little agreement goes on. So the presence in your first language of a rich system should help the acquisition of agreement in a third language. And so specifically, our Arabic speaking learners of French will be more accurate in their production of both number and person agreement, as well as gender agreement too, than their Mandarin speaking peers, all else equal. And by all else equal, we mean those who have the same level in French, general level of French, similar vocabularies. But if we look at just the effect of the L1, we predict that they should be somehow more accurate. The second hypothesis is now the within group. So looking at the Mandarin learners as a whole, or the Arabic speaking learners as a whole. So how do individual differences, cognitive differences in particular, potentially help us to understand? So our general hypothesis is that the differences observed in the production of L3 French agreement with learners sharing the same L1, can be explained by 2 types of variables. First of all, knowledge of language, so first language, second language, and third language vocabulary and grammar, as well as cognitive differences. And specifically, we think that individuals with larger first language Mandarin or Arabic, L2 English and L3 French vocabularies, better L2 English and L3 French grammatical knowledge, and in general, greater working memory executive function, metasyntactic awareness, and statistical learning skills. What will they do? They'll be more accurate in producing L3 French gender and verbal agreement. And just a little side, so far I've talked about individual differences in terms of these cognitive differences. Of course, we have to look at their language knowledge. If you're a second language assessor, for example, the best predictor of almost any ability is vocabulary size. And this is one of the wonderful things. If you have a good vocabulary test, you know a lot about your learners. You don't have to do much more in many cases. Vocabulary even shapes, for example, speech perception. It shapes everything we do. So we wanted to include lexical knowledge. We have tested their vocabulary as well as grammar knowledge. Okay, so now the study itself. So by the end of this study, and we're right now well into the data collection, we want to have 170 individuals. And for my field, this is like going to the World Cup. You never have 170 individuals in any study. So, and collecting this online has been a real challenge. I hope that when your data collection comes, that you can do it in person, unless you want to do it online. So that was one of the things we could talk about later. Challenges of running some of these tests online, incredibly challenging. So we want to have 70 L1 Mandarin speakers, 70 L1 Arabic speakers, and then some controls, 15 each of French and English. Now, all of the participants, including the controls, are undergraduate students for the most part at U of T. And in terms of the learners' French proficiency, they're of a low, intermediate, or higher proficiency. So this is simply a pragmatic choice. In order to be able to do some of these tasks, you have to have a certain level of grammatical proficiency, a certain vocabulary, and a certain ability to do certain speech acts. So the tasks. So one of the reasons this study is so complex, there are 15 tasks that everyone had to do, and they're done over 3 one-hour sessions. So learners completed, first of all, in order to see what their gender and verbal agreement was like, written and spoken production tasks, but we did it in all 3 languages, or 2 of the 3, I should say, languages, the L2 and the L3. We wanted to test, as I just said, both their lexical, their vocabulary, and their lexical grammatical competence. Why do I say lexical grammatical here? We used a closed test. I'll talk about that in a second, and that's not just grammar, it's lexical competence as well. And finally, we had to have measures of these cognitive individual differences that we think might play a role in grammar learning. So 3 sessions, and each session there were multiple tasks. The sessions were all run by native speakers of the language. So one of the things when you do L3 is you have to make sure that you test the languages independently, and to the best of your abilities that you activate the most the language being taught. We started with the first language, and they were always on different days, sometimes weeks apart or days apart. So there wasn't that kind of concurrent language activation, because some of the tasks we wanted them to do in the L1 first. So if they weren't as strong in French, they had already practiced in a language that they were more fluent in. So we tested them with a vocabulary test, unfortunately, and this is something to think about if you have to look at your learners' proficiency. It's sometimes more surprising than one would think to get the types of tasks you need. So for example, when I started this, I thought, oh, vocabulary. I've actually developed vocabulary tests for French, all types. When we went to make vocabulary tasks for the Mandarin Arabic speakers and first language, there was nothing. We looked across the globe, but for native speakers of this level, so we had to develop these tasks. And that was a whole, I would probably say each of those tasks took us 50 to 100 hours just to develop one task. They had to be frequency controlled, they had to be normed, like in Arabic, which variants of Arabic are we looking at? Anyway, closed tasks were easy. We simply took the Little Red Riding Hood story. We wanted a story that was known by all 4 cultures, and based on the people I asked, this was known. And closing, if you know what it is, you take a paragraph, you simply leave the first 2 sentences intact, and then beginning with the 3rd sentence, every 6th, 7th, 8th or so word, you take out the word and you have to complete the passage. Closed tasks have been shown to be an extremely good predictor of overall language proficiency, both in first and second language speakers. And then we have these other tasks. I'm going to show you one of them. A working memory task, very simple, digit. That simply means you repeated strings of numbers that were longer and longer. And you simply, the more numbers you were able to recall, the higher your score. I'm going to show you our metasyntactic awareness task in a second. It's an error reproduction task. And then we had 2 of these kind of cognitive function. Executive function is called a Simon task. These are tasks where you have to learn to ignore certain information and pay attention to others. So it's not the task we use, but for example, often what people do is say the color that is of the word. And so sometimes you'll have red the word red in red, but then you'll have red in the green. So when you see red in the green font, you have to ignore the visual stimulus and still see the red color. So this allows us to detect how people can separate out information types and focus on what they need to focus on. The statistical learning task, and we don't know yet whether this is probably the worst in the sense of most demanding. For 25 minutes, you have to sit in front of a screen and you're presented with strings of letters and numbers. And at the end, you have to tell, based on what your input is, whether a new set of strings of letters and numbers are possible. And we're not sure whether the online environment, particularly with this generation of students who might hopefully not have been on their cell phones at the same time, whether this will be an accurate test to be seen. Okay. So for example, metasyntactic awareness, what did we do? So I'm going to give you an example. This was borrowed from colleagues in Montreal that was originally developed the task for child learners, native speakers. We just adapted it for second language learners. The task was done in the L1, either in Arabic or Mandarin. So once again, one of the things about this study, we always had to parallel tasks. So we had to develop the same type of items in Mandarin and Arabic. And you can imagine, as you, even if you don't speak the languages, based on what you've seen, these languages are so different. Trying to get comparable test items was a real challenge. It probably took us about 100 and some hours to develop each task. Here's the task. So in this task, and you can see if you can get this right. In this task, you're going to hear two sentences that you will also see to help you. For each pair of sentences, the first sentence always contains an English error, while the second sentence is correct and contains no error. What you need to do is find the error in the first sentence, then change the second sentence so that it contains the same error. It's an error reduplication. We'll do two practice examples to check that you understand what you need to do. So here, for time constraints, I'm only going to show you one item. So once again, you're going to see two sentences. The first one has a grammatical error. The second one doesn't, and you have to change the second sentence so it has the same grammatical error. Okay, so here's the item. I'll read this rather than play the recording. The TV on the stand is really old, that's made of wood. The car on the driveway that's paved is a Porsche. So I don't know if you want to put it in the chat or not, or you can just think about it. So you have to reproduce the error in the first sentence in the second sentence. And what this requires is that you're able to do a grammatical analysis of both sentences and to see what has been changed in order to make the error and then to make the same change in the second sentence. So this is not so easy. So the correct answer should be, the car on the driveway is a Porsche that's paved. Ungrammatical, I think any of us would agree that's not a grammatical sentence. So what basically is this metalinguist? You have to realize that the subordinate clause modifying the subject needs to be put to following the direct object. Okay, you don't have to tell us that, you just have to do it. Okay, and so these items got more and more difficult. This isn't one of the first items. Okay, so in French now. In French, we had basically vocabulary tests, different vocabulary tests, the Little Red Riding Hood passage again, and then we had our dependent variables. We wanted to see how they could produce agreement. So I'm going to show you now the simpler task, which is identification task, and I'll show you the narrative task in English because we did them in both languages. So here was what we asked them to do. Not very hard if you speak some French, but that's okay. So we also have to things in a paradigm, 15 tasks that people do well, otherwise they get unmotivated. So you're going to see a pair of images, each with two similar people or objects. For each pair, you will be asked a question. The answer to the question will involve identifying one of the people or objects. Your answer should include a characteristic of one of the people or objects, as well as the person or object's name. For example, the big dog. Do not answer by referring to the position of the image. For example, the one on the right. Let's start with a couple of practice items. So once again, we're not going to practice. I'm just going to give you an example. So something as simple as you have this image and then you would hear, I don't think I shared my sound, so I'll just say it here. Quelle voiture est bleue? Okay. Which car is blue? And so hopefully most people would say, oh, it's the small one. So then you would say, la petite voiture. Okay, so this is very straightforward and it was generally good at eliciting data. This was our simple, more controlled task. Okay, in English then. So in English now, we had, once again, vocabulary, a third vocabulary task. We tried originally to have the task for all three languages, but it was impossible. And we had the Little Red Riding story again. So by this time, they really knew the story. But once again, the words in each language were different that were missing. So it didn't help having done the other task. And then we had our narrative tasks. So what does that mean? So along with the identification task, we also had the more fluent language use. So we had 2 storyboards. This is the one for the written narrative. 6 pictures. It's the same event structure in both. Basically the setup, the initial action in place, the event, the consequence of the event, and then the end, okay? And this was done in the past tense. As you can see in the second, if you can see that, several weeks earlier, had the same, if it was done in another language, it would have been that language. And so basically we had them write this out or speak it. Okay, so here's an example of one of the texts that this elicited. The English ones were on average longer than the French ones. Not surprising, they were more competent in English. So you can see for the most part, it's very grammatical, not always idiomatic, but the woman is calling someone, possibly a friend, to talk about what happened during her vacation at the beach. She had been preparing for this and she was excited. At the beach, she could be seen sitting on the sling chair and relaxing herself. There were people surfing, blah, blah, blah. So we see some things, and relaxing herself. Okay, that's ungrammatical. You don't say that in English. It's not a reflexive verb. But for the most part, the agreement here is very, very high. So English is something they had already mastered. These are undergraduate students at U of T. It'd be hard not to have good English and do well, particularly in language. Okay. So getting close to the end of the talk. So once again, so here we have this study with a lot of people doing a lot of things, and then you got to analyze a lot of data. So this has been one of the big challenges. This is one of the reasons we have, right now I have a team of 13 undergraduates working on this. So we have 140 people tested 3 times. That's 420 sessions, another 30. So we had 451 hour sessions to analyze. You can imagine. So some are auto-scored. You may know what Qualtrics is, the data collection device. That's easy. But other things require human or human-computer assessment. So I'm going to give you an idea. And this is, I'm saying this in part not to impress, but to make you think about your own data. It's not collecting the data that's often the hard part. It's preparing and analyzing it. So here's an example. These oral narratives. So the same thing. They saw another story and they talked for up to 2 minutes. So there's 6 steps in analyzing this data. So first you have this hour-long recording. You have to take it easy enough. But then you send it off to someone who has Google Transcriber. And just something to know, if you do end up with oral data to transcribe, Google is amazing. It's highly accurate, it's inexpensive, and it's for many, many languages. So then 2 individuals check that Google doesn't make a mistake. Google makes a mistake, like Siri, this is not a human being. Then we had sent it off. We had to generate a customized algorithm using Python. So I went to a PhD student in computer science who's also works on language, and he programmed this algorithm. We could not have done this without this computer algorithm. And once again, so then we get an output, which is a huge Excel file, and it has to be checked. I won't show you, but it's a little bit intimidating. It's just like, wow. And then the data are finally able to be analyzed. So from start to finish, it's about 3 hours just to get the data ready for each speaker. So this is a huge amount of work. Okay, we're almost at the end of the talk. Perfect timing, I guess. I didn't time this, but it's going to work out. So now, when all is done, and that will be sometime this summer, I hope, we're going to have 15 tasks for each of the learners and a fewer number for the native speakers. And so what do we do at this point? Well, as I said, I'm really a quantitative researcher first and foremost. So what we're going to do is use the typical y equals mx plus b that you learned in high school, a straight line, right? That's a regression, but very, very complex models that allow us to look at variables with a large number of both continuous and discrete variables, something discrete like Arabic or Mandarin, and continuous scores on tests, etc. So just to give you an example, I did a very quick analysis. So what I did, I took some of the Mandarin-speaking learners' data, and I took their results, their scores on the identification task, that la petite voiture, la voiture blanche, or la voiture bleue, whatever. And I simply looked, how well does their closed test score in French predict their ability? And if we add for this task, both their metasyntactic awareness, their error reproduction score, as well as their working memory score, that's the recall of the digits, do those contribute to predicting variability? Well, and I'll just lead you through the important thing to hear is basically this last column, okay? So when I enter this into the sequential regression, basically it tells us 0.52 is 52%, is that the variation we see in the scores among our Mandarin learners in this very small subsample is about 30 individuals. 52% of that difference between the learners is related to their closed test score. And this is a recurrent finding. Knowing grammar, knowing vocabulary is important. Okay, now next, I added, well, what happens if we also look at not only their grammar knowledge, but their metasyntactic awareness and their working memory? Well, as you can see, NS means non-significant. At least with this data, this made no difference. So at least on this task, being more aware of language structure or having a better working memory didn't help. Now, that's not a problem. This is a simple task. And one of the recurrent finding with a lot of cognitive differences is they don't matter for simpler language use. It's for more complex language use. So my prediction would be, even if this tendency is the same when I have all 140 learners, when I go and look at particularly the speaking, the oral narrative task, we may find effects of these variables. So that's another thing to keep in mind. When you're looking in variables, their predictive power is related to what people are doing the task and how, okay? And it may also be the case that once we add in other things, for example, as their French vocabulary, they may be interacting and there may be effect. Okay, so we're just at the end of what I believe is my time. So just want to give a shout out to all those wonderful people who have worked with me on this, including so many of our students. So this is work with both Becky Chen downstairs, if we were on the 10th floor at Applied Psychology. She's been working on the Mandarin side, as well as the Alexandra Guittardo at the University of Waterloo. She was the main grant applicant. Bunch of graduate students to all of them. They programmed, they developed tasks, they recruited participants, they solved problems with software. We also had some linguistic consultants. So when you work in a language you don't speak fluently, you need to have experts. And even though I'm a linguist, I understand how language works. I don't speak Mandarin or Arabic. Obviously, this had government funding from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. And last and most important, I'll say, are just people I really wanted as all these undergraduates. You can see that this was a huge group of 20-some undergraduates who've worked over the last year and a bit. And there's some of them that were using their native speaker competence, et cetera. And without these people, this work would not have been possible. And with that, I will conclude and thank you for having listened.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Yeah, great, really, and very clear. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are all invited now to start interacting after this beautiful talk. And yeah, both on if you have questions, clarifications, maybe start with them. Otherwise, if everything was clear, just let's see how we can interact. We have the chance of having Jeff with us, and so go further in this, and even in relation, as I said, to the readings, that can be the opportunity. Okay.
And Enrique, do we want to turn off the recording at this point so we're in camera again?
Yes, thank you so much for reminding
No problem.
me. Yeah, stop recording.
Okay, yeah, so